Newcastle United look like they want to get to the next level. Have they assembled the right team? Well, Paul Mitchell's arrived as a sporting director, and this is what he's had to say in his interview. Yes, welcome back to Newcastle Fans TV. Paul Mitchell, who was announced just a couple of weeks ago as the new sporting director of Newcastle United, has done his first interview with NUFCTV, with the club's internal media outlet, of course. And what an interview it was. And the first thing I will say, I thought it was very, very impressive. I really, really did. I think there were so many different aspects, which we'll talk about in this video as well. Before we get into this video, please like and subscribe. Like this video, subscribe to the channel as well, because it is something that we really want you to enjoy continuing in terms of the support for Newcastle Fans TV. So what did we get out of this Paul Mitchell interview? Well, the one word that was repeating itself again and again and again was ambition. The ambition of Newcastle United, the ambition of the ownership, the ambition of the management, the ambition of everybody, the players, the staff behind the scenes. It's aligned. And it certainly looks like Newcastle United want to go to that next level. And that was mentioned a few times in the interview with Paul Mitchell. Now, one of the first questions was just like any sort of player or member of staff coming to the club, why Newcastle United? And obviously Paul mentioned a few times, obviously he went to Monaco, he's been all over in terms of footballing, a footballing CV, if you like, England and Europe as well, and so much experience and so much knowledge. And I think he said it was the right time to go back to England, and he's a northern lad, and Newcastle just seemed to be the right fit, which is great to see. Because a lot of people have mentioned that Paul Mitchell coming to Newcastle is a bit of a coup, and with his resume, with his his work behind the scenes in so many different football clubs, he has a good record at Tottenham and Southampton as well, along with Monaco. There was so many different people behind the scenes thinking, actually, this is actually a really good move for Newcastle. They've done very well to get him. And hopefully that will be the case when you look at it and go, well, look at Paul Mitchell's done to X, Y, and Z department, which we'll go on to in throughout the video. Now, what is the role of a sporting director at Newcastle United? Well, according to Paul Mitchell, it is to oversee the sporting investment. So what the likes of PIF and the Rubens are putting into this football club, what are they getting out of it? And how can it be improved on a daily basis, if you like? And the main aspects were the men's team, the women's team, of course, and the academy. How can we make that better? And I really like the fact that he wants to see a 9-year-old Newcastle United player, in terms of a kid off the streets of Newcastle. How can we get him into the first team throughout the steps, from being age 9, playing for the under-10s, through the academy, working his way up and playing for the first team? Because he really wants to develop inside the club and also how outside the club in terms of recruitment, which we'll touch on about. But player development was mentioned a lot in terms of how can we improve within, in terms of the players that we do have. And that also relates to the performance side of things and analysis, that likes of James Bunce, who's also come in as well. How are they going to work together, which we'll mention very, very shortly. But the recruitment is obviously the big thing for a sporting director. And it was mentioned a couple of times in the interview, particularly at the end of Paul Mitchell's interview. Recruitment, what we're going to do in this transfer window, what's the short-term goals? And he was never going to say we're going to be after this player, this player, or this player, but he was saying that yes, essentially stuff will be done, but we need to make sure that we do the necessary work in terms of, well, this is the sort of position that we want, and we'll work together in terms of Eddie Howe and other people within the side of the football club. And I think that was really interesting as well, because the relationship with Eddie Howe is a big, big talking point, because Eddie Howe is the bookies' favourite currently to become the next England manager. Now, according to reports, Eddie Howe has lost a big ally in Amanda Staveley, who, of course, had 10% of the club, and it did go down to 6% at one time. Now she doesn't have any shares at the football club, of course, and that has been well documented, that Amanda Staveley and Mehrdad Gattuso were big fans of Eddie Howe and had his back, if you like. But Newcastle United have had to move on, and Paul Mitchell was very complimentary of Eddie Howe, and of course he's going to be. And he says it was a natural collaboration between his, I suppose, journey and Eddie Howe's journey, both coming from the down south and working their way up. Of course, Eddie Howe through Bournemouth, and obviously Paul Mitchell started at MK Dons, which he mentioned in his interview as well. But similar motivations was the the phrase that was mentioned a couple of times, and the fact that player development is also quite key. Eddie Howe, very much we've seen at Newcastle, the likes of Joe Linton, the likes of Miguel Almiron. I know he's not had the best spell recently, but he has improved since Eddie Howe has come at the football club, and we can say that about so many players. Dan Burn, Jamal Lascelles. He's made Bruno even better since he's come at the football club, and Alexander. It rolls off the tongue in terms of the players that he's improved, like Jacob Murphy's of the world as well. So yeah, very, very interesting. And of course, player development is important, which Paul Mitchell has mentioned, but he also mentioned recruitment development in terms of how that's been better from experiences that Paul Mitchell has had at likes of Monaco and Tottenham and Southampton. You can just list some of the players that Paul Mitchell has managed to attract to these various clubs, and you think, wow, I want a little bit of that in Newcastle over the next few years. So that will be interesting to see how that develops. But James Bunt as well has also come in as an elite specialist in performance and analysis, and particularly obviously the injury side of things. And we had a horrendous injury record, and it was interesting that Paul Mitchell said that everybody was aligned to say, actually, no, this is not good enough. Eddie Howe was saying it's not good enough. The ownership saying this is not good enough. What's going wrong? And that was mentioned and needed to be improved, and certainly was mentioned by Paul Mitchell. But massive fan of James Bunt by the sound of it. Of course, they've worked together before. Again, they wanted to prevent injuries, which is, of course, a massive factor in any football club, not necessarily Newcastle United. But look, we want to make sure that we're improving. And the next 5 years, which obviously Paul Mitchell's mentioned a couple of times in this interview, is quite key. And that is your short to medium term, if you like, in any sort of business. So it will be very, very interesting to see what happens in terms of this, but you can only be really, really impressed. And I'll end this video by talking about the women's team and the fact that they want to be leaders, not followers. I really like that saying. I thought that was a really good saying. And I know that's the same. I know the women's team was obviously improving with back-to-back promotions, and Paul Mitchell, of course, has expressed how much of a good job Becky Langley's done, and she has just done an incredible job since she's been at Newcastle United. But leaders, not followers, that could be the next banner at women's games as well. You could even say that in terms of the men's team. I know it's probably a longer road, even though they're in the Premier League, of course, but there's still that gap between Newcastle and, if we're looking at, say, Manchester City right now, who are top of the Premier League and won the Premier League so many times, there is that gap, and can we reduce it? Let's wait and see. But overall, a very, very good interview in terms of what NUFCTV have done with Paul Mitchell. You can only be excited. You can only thinking, you know what, let's give this guy a chance. Let's give him the patience and the time to make things work, which he mentioned as well. But if anyone's patient, Newcastle United fans are patient. They've been waiting so long for a takeover. They've been waiting so long for a trophy. We're still waiting for that, of course. But we don't mind waiting too long if we get the right things at the end. And I think we've got the right team, and that's the most important thing. We've got the team behind the team, if you like, right. And I think that's really, really impressive. And you can't help but be excited for the future for Newcastle United. Get your comments in. What do you make of the interview? What did you like? What did you dislike? Was there anything that you disliked about the interview? And how much of an impact do you think Paul Mitchell will have at Newcastle United? And do you think that it will be successful?